Welcome to Renegade Inc., the show that allows us to think differently. The literal Old French translation of the word mortgage is death pledge. In Britain, the mortgage market is worth more than £1.3 trillion. But how many of these mortgages are fatally flawed? Joining me to discuss the Great British Mortgage Swindle are the filmmakers Michael O'Benicia and Michael O'Dira. Gentlemen, welcome. You've made a big polemic film, let's be honest about it. Why did you make the Great British Mortgage Swindle?
Because one day I woke up and I decided that I was going to research exactly why it was that since I was a kid, I'd had a feeling that the banks were lying to people. I just didn't know what the specifics of the lie, the mechanics of the lie. I needed to ascertain them. So I went and I researched it, and within about 15, 20 minutes, I'd found the start of what became the Great British Mortgage Swindle.
How long ago did you find out that within this 15 or 20 minutes that actually something was untoward?
2008 was when I found enough evidence that not only were the bank not applying the laws, they were having laws applied in their favour to the detriment of the people when the people could never rely on any form of remedy. And the form that this revelation took was very simplistic. I started looking for one mortgagor who'd beaten a bank in one of Her Majesty's courts, and I couldn't find one because there weren't any. I
just want to link two things here. You had an intuition as a kid, you said.
I did.
How old?
18.
Right, so you had an intuition at 18 that the financial system wasn't running on the sort of principles that you thought it should be. Is that about right?
Yes.
And then it took to 2008, post-crash?
Yeah.
Or pre-crash?
Oh, no, I was looking into it before the crash, and it was like seeing a car crash in slow motion.
Right, because you knew, you'd put two and two together, and you suddenly saw in real time this unfolding.
Well, I went to answer a question, and that question was, what does the so-called financial bubble or the housing bubble, what does it consist of and what's its cause? So first and foremost, when somebody goes into a bank and they ask for a mortgage and sit down with the mortgage broker, very quickly the mortgage broker will give them the documents that they need to give to a conveyancing solicitor who they engage. And the conveyancing solicitor will soon sit them down and say, OK, this is a situation. You have to sign this mortgage deed in order to secure the funds to buy the house. So if you do that now, it'll all go through. So they sign on the dotted line, and that document is taken by the bank and deposited in a private account, and they then pretend to lend that money back to the customer at compound interest for 25 years. In other words, the mortgage deed that is signed is the credit that's created. It creates the credit. And then that credit, they pretend to lend back at compound interest for 25 years. So the second aspect of it that must be considered is it's actually illegal to sign any mortgage deed to a property that you don't yet own. And that point was hammered home significantly in a case called Southern Pacific Mortgages in 2015, when in the Supreme Court, the President of the Supreme Court, Lady Hale, ruled that despite the common practice of the entire conveyancing industry for many years, it was in fact entirely right that nobody has either a legal or equitable right to sign a deed to any property prior to becoming the owner of it. The third bit is that generally they're given these deeds to sign and take home, or they're sent the deeds in the post. And when they receive them, they're told to sign them and send them back to the conveyancing solicitor, who then adds a witness to the signature. But they weren't there at the time and place of execution, so again, it's another fraud. On virtually every mortgage deed, the witness was not there at the time it was signed, and they have to be.
So banks create money out of thin air, lend it at interest, and you as filmmakers are saying to a wider audience, we think there's enough fraud or mis-selling or miscomprehension, misunderstanding around that process for us to put a film together and tell a wider audience.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is, it's not totally true to say that they're creating money out of thin air. Because what they're doing is they're taking possession of these mortgage deeds, which are charges and as such are security interests. It forms also the promise to pay. The promissory note is the agreement that gets signed in the US. Over here, as Michael has explained, there's a little bit more subterfuge, a few more veils over it, because it is a multi-levelled swindle.
So if we say, if we don't say that banks create money out of thin air, How do we put it a different way?
They're creating credit on the back of the mortgagor's promise to pay back the principal plus certain amounts in compound interest over the next 25 years. The promise to pay is what creates the money, if you like.
Do they have that money in the bank when that mortgage application goes in?
No, because as Professor Richard Werner has outlined in some detail, that it's largely simply a case of tapping a few figures onto a computer screen. I was having a conversation with a chartered accountant the other day who'd contacted me over his property portfolio, and he'd become aware of this religious belief that the banks have actually loaned you money. It's the biggest delusion of all, and it operates on an earth-wide level. It controls everything. It's all very well thinking, right, so-and-so can be in charge of credit creation if that guy is whiter than white, blemish-free. But if you've got someone who is psychopathic in nature and wants to control huge swathes of humanity, then what better industry to get into than banking, where you have the Midas touch, or so it appears.
And the Midas touch is?
The monetary mechanics that allow them to create what appears to be money out of thin air. You see, this is the thing. Some people would say that we were crazy to do what we have done on the basis that the system would never acknowledge that you were correct and they would come down heavy on you, which was certainly the case. But nevertheless, it was the right thing to do, because at the time, it was a case, well, when I first met Michael back in 2009 through a mutual friend, I was of the view, right, let's crack on with this, because there must be lots of people doing it. But it soon became apparent at that time, we were the only two, really, that were making inroads via the court system.
According to the Ministry of Justice, from 1989 to 2009, an average of 25,000 residential properties were forcibly taken by county court bailiffs following mortgage possession proceedings. Over the past 30 years, at an average of 4 people per household, 3 million people, many of whom were small children, have been thrown out into the street and left for dead on the orders of Her Majesty's judiciary.
You're not down here in 1 minute. I'm coming through the door. Right, I can take possession. No, you can't come in. I can. Right. I'm just in bed. Are you obstructing? I haven't been given a notice. You're obstructing an officer of the court. You've got to serve me notice. No, I don't have to, I'm afraid. Not this time. You've got to serve me. I'm the tenant. I've got my tenant right. You haven't served me notice. No. Take your hands off me. You're assaulting me. Right, I'm asking you. You are assaulting me. You are obstructing. I'm not obstructing you. Listen. I've just got out of bed. Right. You've served me no notice. Right. I have not seen the warrant. You are right. I have not seen the warrant. If you obstruct me in coming through this door, I'm not touching you. You will be under arrest. No, you haven't served me any notice. Where's the notice? 2 officers. Right, I'm being arrested. You just got me out of bed. I'm being arrested.
How many times through the filmmaking process have you both been called conspiracy theorists?
I think at last count it was about 3.5 million.
Yeah.
We were talking about this, the use of that term this morning. I think it's increasingly a redundant expression, because we're talking about the facts of money and its creation, monetary mechanics. Conspiracy theory is a shorthand term to deny something that's actually taking place, and there's evidence to back that up. It's just things that are happening. It's not a theory. But yes, it has happened occasionally.
Any pioneers in any field, they always have to take the most flack. I think that I was prepared for it in a way that perhaps nobody else involved in the film was prepared for it, because I'd already seen everything stolen from my family when I was 18, because that was my wake-up call. It was the last day of my A-levels, and my morning was spent overseeing our eviction from our home of 8 years because of my dad's personal bankruptcy, which occurred during the first 80s recession. He's managed to stave off losing the house for 7, 8 years. Basically, that morning, I was on my own because my mother was suffering so much mentally with the trauma of it all. My sister was a lot younger than me, so my dad took them away to, take them away from the brunt, and I agreed to bear it. And I was prepared for all of the things that you would expect when you're getting evicted from your house. But what I wasn't prepared for was the spite and sheer downright nastiness of the official receiver driving up at the end of the day when I'm standing there waiting for my granddad to pick me up and take me back, to their house where I'm staying until we got somewhere else to live. And as a family is being kicked out onto the street, as, you know, just a kid on the last day of his A-levels is standing on the grass looking at the home where he spent his formative years, this man winds his electric window down and says to me with a smirk on his face, just make sure that everything's out that house, because if it's not, then we're just going to bin it. And so I said, in the inimitable words of my forefathers, I said, you've got 10 seconds to leave, or I won't be responsible for my actions. And he went after 3. And from that moment, I knew something was drastically wrong. I couldn't put my finger on what it was, but I knew that we were all being played.
Why? Because you surely, when you look back to your 18-year-old self, you don't understand it. Intuitively, you feel something. Now you've made the film. Now you've done all the research. What was that bit that was wrong?
My granddad was the owner of the house, and they stole it from us, claiming that it was my dad's house, really. That's why. And it was all done through the courts, very aggressively through the High Court.
Is the British legal system, then, part of the problem in the sense that there has not been one mortgagor winning against these interests?
To make one correction, there now has been one mortgagor winning. It happened in our case. We were the first to win.
What does that say about the wider legal system?
We proved beyond doubt that unless you're willing to throw everything you've got at fighting a seemingly never-ending war of attrition to get a result against a bank in a court, the only way you can do it is by being so determined and so clever that you trick them into a position where they're going to do something that they're not going to see the consequences of. In our case, the judge fell into the trap where, to get rid of us, he had to admit one thing which no judge had ever admitted in a case involving a mortgagor.
And that was? That
the Law of Property Miscellaneous Provisions Act 1989 did not apply to mortgages. And that changed in 2014 when we proved that it did. But since then, to finish the answer to your question, the judge who gave the verdict to us still, in the same hearing, attempted to help the bank win by declaring that they still had the right to create another mortgage in the name of the trustees and to have it registered. So the judge who gave us the results still tried to give a result to the bank simultaneously. And I was handed last summer at a meeting with Thames Valley Police Commissioner Anthony Stansfeld, I was handed a file of evidence which proves beyond any doubt that there was a deal done by the banks with Parliament whereby they promised that no serving MP would be declared bankrupt provided no judge found fraud against any of the banks.
Welcome back to Renegade Inc., the show that allows us to think differently. I'm here talking about the Great British Mortgage Swindle with the filmmakers Michael O'Bernicia and Michael O'Dera. Just recap what the Great British Mortgage Scandal is, if you will.
It's a hard-hitting documentary set in London, Nottingham, Newcastle and Edinburgh and Coventry. It's a film that exposes how the justice system in the UK is completely rigged to protect the banks from the consequences of their myriad of crimes. And the film sets out to demonstrate exactly what those crimes are.
When you use the word crimes, and I have to pull you up on it, you say crimes, but these are legal actions the banks are taking, are they not?
No, they're not. If they were following the law, they would be legal actions. But because they break the law so many times in each case, they actually forfeit their legal rights and their equitable rights because they've committed fraud from the get-go. And the film examines exactly what form that fraud takes. And it takes many forms. But it's also the story of 5 pioneering lay litigants who take on the bank's frauds over mortgages in and out of court. And it follows some of them, including Michael, as they end up, despite having proven their cases in court, getting their houses stolen.
Michael, what's your story? What happened to you?
Well, I was evicted twice, both of which feature in the documentary. The first time was when I challenged the Bradford and Bingley, as they were at the time, to prove that they had a valid charge over my home of, I think it was 16 years at the time. And also to demonstrate that they had a valid contract with me, that they'd fully disclosed everything about how the loan was created, and to demonstrate that they'd actually loaned me anything in the first place. So the film documents our first meeting back in the autumn of 2009, right through the court action I was going through from that time August 2009 through till when I was evicted on the 4th of November 2010, after a series of appearances in a number of courts at all levels of the judiciary. County Court, High Court, Appeal Court, and also some attempts to have the charge removed at the Land Registry. And then the following year, I was homeless, so I was living in a friend's house, which was under threat from another mortgage company. And again, the same judge issued a possession order on the house. And what that second eviction demonstrated was the extreme lengths, the judiciary, the bailiffs, and the local constabulary, it has to be said, will go to enforce the Great British Mortgage Swindle. And it is extreme, you know, I would regard it as nothing less than state-sponsored terrorism on the basis that some of these mortgage companies were, first of all, bailed out by the British people to the tune of billions, tens of billions of pounds. And secondly, in the case particularly of the Bradford and Bingley, it's now run by an organisation called UCAR, which is a Treasury-backed institution that's been set up to wind down the mortgage books of the Bradford and Bingley and Northern Rock, both of which collapsed in 2008.
You use the word terrorism. Is that a bit harsh?
If I refer you to the eviction of the Alberts in the film, he's in the house with his mother in Coventry, and the High Court enforcement officers swoop on the house, supported by the local constabulary. They get angle grinders to break in, drag his mother out of the house, down the stairs, to such an extent that you can see in the film she's really severely bruised.
On 7th of January at 5:30 in the morning, we were attacked in our family home. I was physically assaulted and thrown out by my wrists and ankles by an unidentified man who I believe to be a combination of High Court enforcement officers and police.
Oh my God!
On the 7th of January 2014, dozens of tooled-up police and High Court enforcement officers broke into the Alberts Coventry home before dawn, dragging Ella Albert out of her bed, down the stairs and into the street, causing actual bodily harm.
What? She's been look, stressed. Whoa! What are you doing?
What's been the personal cost of this?
First of all, I didn't realise at the time, but I was traumatised by it. Particularly the first, again, it goes back to this point about state-sponsored terrorism, because they did the same to us. They came at 8 o'clock in the morning, the day after I'd had a birthday party, and they turn up on the street with 21 police officers, and the whole area is cordoned off.
So it's this word terrorism. Is it not state-sponsored violence? Is that not a better term?
There was a time when I was going round, and I was very twitchy around whenever the police would show up or were in the vicinity.
And then, but a lot of people say, yeah, but you haven't paid your bills. Of course,
that's another point. That's another interesting point as well, because I worked out that the bank alleged it had loaned me £34,000 on a house that was paid for on the day back in 1994. I worked out that over the course of the next 15 years, I'd paid them some £68,000 in terms of compound interest and on the original alleged debt.
But again, the man or woman on the street rightly would say, well, but you took out that mortgage, therefore you're liable because you put your signature on that note. And that is the argument that you're rejecting.
Well, no, because I had legal advice. I had a conveyancing solicitor advising me about what to do and how. I wanted a legal mortgage, remember? At that time, I thought I simply wanted a loan in order to buy the house. So I approached my friend who was a conveyancing solicitor and expected that he would organise that and advise me correctly that the whole thing was legal. But even at that stage, again, it goes back to the point you were asking, Michael, about this intuition. There was a time, certainly, I think it was on the day I moved into the house, and I just had this gut instinct that it was all wrong. It was all just a facade, and quite possibly one of the worst decisions I'd ever made.
And what was the gut instinct?
That I'd been conned.
By?
By the solicitor and by the bank. And I'd studied economics at A-level, and I like to think I had a good grasp on these things. But at school, you never taught about monetary mechanics, how it works, the illusion that is behind money and its creation.
Why not?
Well, why do you think? They don't want people knowing this information. The information in the Great British Mortgage Swindle has the potential to have a very big impact on people and on their consciousness and on their understanding of the world around them.
A lot of people who are victims of the mortgage system, let's just call it that, they think, well, look, obviously the facts stack up. I'll take this to an independent court. The court will find that I am being wronged here, and they'll rule accordingly, right? Mm-hmm. And it seems to me, having watched your work and other people's cases around the country and actually the wider world, that they're left with nowhere else to go when suddenly, surprisingly, the judgment doesn't come for them. Is that a regular occurrence?
It's endemic. It's endemic. We both get a lot of requests for help. I mean, if I say that there was a time when I was getting 100 emails a day and at least 25 of those were from people who were desperate for my help all at the same time.
With mortgage problems?
With mortgage problems, on the brink of eviction, fighting in court, just about to go into court, just had a note from the door asking, saying there's going to be a possession hearing. And in each case, I would do my best to help in any way I could. And after all these years doing it, I now have to say the same thing to everybody. And that is, unless you understand that you can only put off the inevitable for so long and that it's so likely that they come with the heavies and steal your house, unless you understand that that's what happens to virtually everybody, then I can't lead you hand in hand into certain machine gun fire, because that's what you're going to face. And you have to be prepared to duck the bullets. And if you don't know when they're going to be fired and how fast and furious they're going to come, you haven't got a hope in hell.
Perhaps a better way of looking at it, rather than saying it's state-sponsored terrorism, is that it's state corporate extortion. I've made this point in court, and they just said to me, well, how is it extortion? And I said quite simply, because if I don't pay what the bank are asking for, they'll violently steal the house.
What are the solutions? Because we can sit here all day and say it's all wrong and accept that and throw stones at the system, but we also have to come with a solution to say, actually, this is a better way of doing this.
Well, come clean about money and how it's created. Full disclosure as to how the loan was created, and is it really a loan? But that means that certain individuals and entities, corporations would lose their income streams. You know, you've seen The Big Short. The Big Short, one of the characters in there asked the question, well, what kind of individual doesn't pay his mortgage? When they're trying to short the market on the basis that they realise that the system will grind to a halt because there are people who can't pay, that they've taken out these subprime mortgages, which they can't pay.
The mortgage-backed security, or private label MBS. You've got your average person's mortgage, fixed rate, 30 years, boring, safe, small payoff, right? But when you have thousands of them all bundled together, suddenly the yield goes up, but the risk is still small because, well, they're mortgages. And who the hell doesn't pay their mortgage?
That means, ordinary people, whether or not they've got a mortgage, most people are renting a property, and often those properties have a buy-to-let mortgage over them that the landlord is servicing. So, the bank puts up the interest rates. Who gets hit in the pocket? It's the individual that's renting. And one solution might well be, we talked about the Gilets jaunes and the action that they've taken. I've put forward the idea of mortgage strikes, hit them in the, where it hurts in the pocket. It won't take a great number, but mass actions of people making the correct application to have those charges removed at the land registry, because without that registration, the whole thing falls apart. The courts wouldn't have anything to enforce. The banks would have no means of collecting on their, albeit fake, debts.
You're making an application to the land registry. Why is the land registry such an important player in this?
Because it's the only way that you can go around the rigged system to get a result that the law states that you must in certain circumstances. For example, if you go to a court and ask them for compensation for an error that was made in the land register, you get laughed out of court and then charged for it. If you go to the land registry and say, I wish to be indemnified for all my losses from the chief land registrar because there was a fraudulent mortgage registered on this date at that time by me for these reasons. And just another quick summary of the reasons, because the bank can't produce any evidence that they lent me any money, and that's obviously backed up by Professor Richard Werner, as we said, because there is no lawfully binding contract signed by both parties containing all the terms and conditions, as it must under Section 2 of the terms of the 1989 Act, and because the deed was not witnessed in the presence of an independent witness as per the provisions of Section 1 of the 1989 Act, and that should be enough. And if you make an application to the land registry, let's say on the ground that when I signed the deed, I wasn't owner of the property, relying upon the Southern Pacific Mortgages case given in the Supreme Court by Lady Hale, which, just to recap, means that nobody has a legal or equitable right to sign any mortgage deed before they are the actual owner of the property. Well, all of those grounds mean that every single one of the 11.2 estimated UK mortgagors is entitled to seek compensation from the land registry and have all of those mortgages cancelled. Now, all of that value would be a boon to the people who were ripped off by the banks.
So if you say that all these mortgages are fraudulent, and suddenly, let's just say, a utopia, then you say, well, actually, overnight, we can make that case. People then write these mortgages off. There will be corporate losses, no doubt. But suddenly, the householder has enough disposable income to spend into the real economy.
Yes.
That means you can get spending going again, get liquidity going, and actually you could see a kind of renaissance in the real economy.
Well, exactly. Is it not a shift? We hear a lot about how the 1% control and dominate the 99%, you know, and that includes stealing from them. Well, would that not represent a massive retransfer of the wealth of the people back into the hands of the people?
The biggest one of all time it would represent. Now, in the same world, one has to see the flip side, and the flip side is there needs to be a period of transition where we transform the banks from having power over all of our lives in almost every aspect to being the simple administrators of the accounts that hold our wealth. In simple terms, all we're talking about, it's not going to take a dramatic redesign of the entire industry. It's simple. At the moment, the banks steal the credit created by the customer. Well, instead of transferring it into the bank's account, it must be transferred into the customers. And then they've created the money that they need to buy the mortgage, and then they can sign the deed, and everything's perfectly legal and above board.
Gentlemen, congratulations on the film. Lots of hard work. Years in the making. Great contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's it from Renegade Inc. this week. You can drop the team a mail, studio@renegadeinc.com, or you can tweet us at Renegade Inc. Join us next week for more insight from those people who are thinking differently. But until then, stay curious.